Buonasera signori e signore, buonasera e benvenuti all'Accademia Britannica. Sono molto lieto di cominciare non solo questa conferenza da Robert Bevan, ma anche il programma Meeting Architecture III Fragments che noi cominciamo oggi sera. Come voi potete leggere nel flyer, nel depliant che noi abbiamo, Meeting Architecture Fragments rifletterà su come memoria, emozione e ideologia siano costantemente legate alle rovine, agli edifici e a quel che contengono. Questo tema è un tema che è molto appropriato per l'Accademia Britannica e l'Accademia Britannica a Roma. Perché? Perché noi abbiamo da anni studiato in vari modi la storia, l'architettura e i modi in cui l'architettura riflette la storia e la storia include l'architettura come uno degli elementi più importanti per la società e il modo in cui gli uomini convivono. Chiaramente negli anni recenti abbiamo esplorato anche i modi in cui l'architettura è un ponte fondamentale fra diverse discipline, il modo in cui l'arte, la storia, la politica, l'economia, tutte queste discipline possono incontrarsi nella disciplina di architettura. Questo tema allora è emerso da una determinazione da parte dell'Accademia Britannica di riflettere sugli eventi del mondo contemporaneo in un modo che è appropriato ai nostri studi e alle nostre ricerche, che per la maggior parte si concentrano sugli studi umanistici, sull'arte, sulla storia e sull'architettura. Non abbiamo voluto strumentalizzare le nostre discipline, ma invece di guardare i problemi del mondo forse da un altro angolo, un altro punto di vista, per riflettere, ma anche forse di dare un luce diversa. Chiaramente, come voi potete vedere, tanti dei temi che da cui noi parliamo in questa serie di eventi sono molto serie, esplorano alcuni delle parti più buie, più disastrose della nostra storia condivisa. Ma vorrei dire che l'intenzione di questo tema non è solo quello, ma anche di dare un po' di speranza e di usare l'architettura in quel modo, perché l'architettura non è solo la cosa che è stata lasciata dopo gli eventi disastrosi, ma anche il modo in cui noi possiamo ricominciare le comunità e riscoprire i modi in cui noi possiamo trovare una vita condivisa. Allora, questa serie di eventi è una tentativa di offrire un nuovo approccio ai problemi del mondo in cui noi viviamo, un mondo in cui noi vediamo spesso comunità che non possono trovare il modo di vivere insieme, ma noi vogliamo offrire la speranza che fra l'architettura e fra i spazi che noi conviviamo possiamo cambiare un po' questa situazione. Vorrei dire innanzitutto che questo programma è il lavoro, è basato sulla ricerca di Marina Engel, il nostro Curator of Architecture. Sono veramente molto grato a Marina per tutto il suo lavoro. So che Marina vuole dare i suoi ringraziamenti anche ai membri della facoltà dell'Archaeology, History and Letters and Faculty of Fine Arts, e siamo molto contenti di avere i presidenti delle ambedue facoltà qui oggi sera, Professor Rosamund McKittrick e Vivian Lovell. Grazie a voi per essere con noi. Allora, questa è una breve introduzione al lavoro che noi facciamo durante i prossimi 2 o 3 anni e spero che voi potete aggiungerci fra tutto il programma che svilupperà fra i mesi. Adesso io sono assolutamente onorato di avere con noi Robert Bevan di cominciare questa serie. Non si può immaginare qualcuno più appropriato di farlo, ma io non faccio quell'introduzione, ma passo la parola a un amico grande dell'Accademia Britannica, è qualcuno che ha seguito tutte le nostre cose, non solo in architettura ma anche in altre cose, Pippo Ciorra della Maxi. Grazie a voi tutti e passo la parola, grazie.
Two languages, contemporary, no, at the same time. Okay. Thank you everybody, thank you Marina. It's very nice and it's very interesting to be here today, in a very complicated day, I have to say. I spent the last days looking at the work and especially at the book written by Robert Bevan, a new acquaintance for me. And of course, it's about a lot of topics and issues and problems that are extremely on the table today. Because when he wrote the book, this issue of the destruction of monument, as the destruction of memory, as destruction of civilization, as destruction of, your enemy, it was very, very important. But it's even more important today when after you wrote the book, there were even worse events came, the destruction of the archaeology in Syria or other horrible stories like that. So the first thing to say is that the issue that Robert addresses in the book is extremely important, extremely relevant in the construction of our culture today, and it's extremely calling for interdisciplinary help and discussion. So the first reaction was this: around the world, conflicts, wars, and other events threaten our memory by threatening our monuments, buildings, and whatever infrastructures or other historical presence. This, of course, raises another issue we are very much used to in Italy, which is the issue of heritage. So what is heritage, what is not heritage? Robert quotes, of course, one of our favorite readings, which is Hobsbawm. But Hobsbawm is the same guy who says that we cannot remember anything if we don't learn how to forget something. So this means that there's something we will have to protect to the end, and then something we will have to be ready to lose. So what we lose, how do we lose it? How do we preserve its memory even by losing it? And this is all in the book, and it's very, very interesting. The book is also other issues that Italians have been speculating about for generations. How do you restore? How do you rebuild? And how can you use the memory of what was there to rebuild that memory, or to keep that memory in the existence of other buildings, or simply by rebuilding still buildings, as it was done after World War II in Germany or in Poland. We are our disciplines. Architects are very much. They've been spending a lot of time in this discussion in Italy, and somehow what we came out with in the end. And there is no rule. There is a sensibility you can develop through culture. There is a dialogue you can have with society, with experts, with historians, with art historians, that give you the knowledge and the sensibility and the instinct to understand what is proper, what's not proper. There were very strong schools of restorations in Italy, in the 50s and 60s. If you go to the Colosseum, you see the perfect example of one way of being an archaeologist and a regatta, but then if you go to more recent archaeological site, you see completely different approach to this. So it's an open discussion, and it's very important that through the books we have a lot of new ideas, new contributions, new examples, and new stories, because we have been used to speculate on restoration through our, Renaissance or medieval or Baroque legacy, but in this case it's become extremely wider, it takes the whole time from the beginning to the end, to today, and it becomes more and more complicated and interesting. I think also by his own personal experience, Robert raises issues that are involving important agencies today, like UNESCO, like agencies that have like the official international right to put definitions in this. And of course there is a lot of discussion on the idea of memory that UNESCO is propaganding around the world. And so this book is also a contribution, I think, from an insider experience on how much we have to agree with UNESCO. And sometimes UNESCO tends to transform an historic site in another Disney project. So it's a very open and very wide field. On one side, we tend to look at it cynically because in Italy we've been used to lose so much time in this discussion, and in the end we think we got through simply by accepting the idea that there is not a final answer, that you face the restoration problem time by time, and you keep enlarging your culture and your experience to do this as well. But the other side, it helps us to open our eyes to a lot of new situations in the world that are extremely urgent, extremely important, that they would absolutely need our help. When Robert wrote this book, there was no discussion yet about this UNESCO force to go around, that it's under discussion in these days, that UNESCO should have an army, to go around and protect monuments. So it's extremely hot, I would say, the topic, and it will be great to discuss it with you today. One last thing before opening your way. One last thing, and of course it's very specific, very strange, very interesting and stimulating to do this discussion in a country where we always had the problem of not being able to destruct, to demolish. In Italy, whatever substitution, demolition, officially becomes impossible. Then it's very easy, and generally to demolish an important building in sometimes the very history was even easier than demolish an anonymous building. But we do have, I often thought that we have this kind of subconscious idea of the war, of the bombing, of the destruction in some of the cities that becomes an obstacle to the idea of using demolition or destruction as a urban design as could be done so many times. So on one side I react in two different ways to the book. On one side I say yes, of course, we need to develop an even more sophisticated and wider and more complete sensibility to these problems all around the world. And on the other side, say, oh no, if we in Italy, if we become even more attached to our monuments, to our memory, this country will die by paralysis and will never become a modern or post-modern or whatever it is country. And also, it's interesting for me as a cynical observer to put together the sensibility that comes out from your book to a certain new sensibility that there is in the UK for an architecture which has a deeper and smoother dialogue with history. Now, you can tell that in London there's a lot of architects who are looking at history. This worries me a lot. They're looking at history with a different eye. So I think the book is opening an incredible range of topics, and it will be wonderful to discuss them with you and to watch the film, which I think it will be a perfect synthesis of both the destruction and reconstruction issues. Robert Bevan, I think, is the perfect person to deliver to you these topics. He's an architect, but also a planner and a journalist and a UNESCO expert. So he has all the backgrounds we need to address him or even to attack him eventually after, demolish him and turn him into a memory somehow. in this night. Riassumo anche in italiano, però diciamo, è abbastanza semplice, come questo libro racconta di come questo tema della distruzione dei monumenti in campi di guerra, in campi di conflitto, in situazioni di conflitto non sia un problema storico come quello cui siamo abituati a vivere in Italia rispetto al nostro passato e alle rovine che abbiamo perduto e a quelle che abbiamo salvato nel nostro passato, ma è un tema attuale con cui ci confrontiamo tutti i giorni, che oggi è ancora molto più attuale di quando Robert ha scritto il libro, perché quello che succede in Siria, che succede in altri scenari nel mondo ci rende terribilmente sensibili, e lo dice uno il cui maestro fece i piani per Raqqa e Palmira, quindi ci ricordiamo bene. E quindi questi sono gli argomenti importanti. E Robert racconta anche dell'importanza di ricostruire quando è possibile queste memorie, di come si possono ricostruire, di quanto false possano essere, di quanto anche una rovina falsa in alcune situazioni ha un valore importante nei confronti della comunità, e di come la disciplina, gli intellettuali, gli architetti, gli heritage men possono riferirsi a queste discussioni aperte. È anche vero, a Roma lo sappiamo benissimo, che la distruzione è un metodo di progettazione ciclico e continuo, no? Questa è una città fatta attraverso la sua stessa distruzione, e quindi è un discorso che non può essere visto come una scatola chiusa, ma che ha infinite porte dentro le quali possiamo entrare e argomentare, anche diciamo smontando un pochino le argomentazioni e vedendole da un punto di vista diverso. Robert Bevan ha una ampia educazione come architetto, pianificatore, esperto di heritage, giornalista, scrittore, esperto sul campo. Lui è andato a collaborare con le agenzie internazionali nei luoghi specifici dove questi problemi sono affrontati, quindi penso che sia la persona più adatta e più interessante con la quale intavolare un discorso questa sera, dopo però che ci saremo visti il suo film. Thank you very much. You can introduce.
Thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. If you'll indulge me, I'll speak a few minutes now and then again for a little longer after the screening of the film tonight. The footage in the film is much more powerful than endless words that I might say. And it's based on a book I wrote about 15 years ago now called The Destruction of Memory, Architecture at War, that was published. It was published in 2006 and a new edition was coming out in January. At the time it felt like a really esoteric project. I began writing it just before 9/11, and I was finding it really difficult to explain the subject matter to people. I think in the UK in particular, the idea of targeted destruction was something they hadn't really considered. At least not since the Second World War and the sort of tit-for-tat raids between the Allies and the Axis powers. So, and when I talked to them about the bombing of buildings, from houses or monuments, people tended to assume I was talking about collateral damage, the architecture that got in the way of armies fighting, regrettable, but such is life or war. But that's not what the book is about, or the film. It's about calculated destruction. It's not about peacetime renewal or all the arguments you have about what you retain, what you renew, and how you do that. It's about targeting. It's how it's used as a weapon of war, and not only during war, but also in the manner of rebuilding afterwards, and who does that, the decisions that are made. It can be rebuilding can sometimes be as problematic as the destruction itself. It can rewrite history in a different way. But what prompted the writing of the book originally was guilt. As a small child, I was fascinated by architecture and loss and war, and I'd drag big volumes out of the library and look at the photographs of these lost architectural glories, burned out or bombed or left to crumble. But at the same time, you could find me glued to the TV, watching an extraordinary British documentary series from the early 70s called The World at War, which ran for 26 episodes and charted the whole course of the war in a lot of detail. More destroyed cathedrals, devastated cities, looted and burned artworks. And this made me immensely sad. But it also made me guilty because I seemed to be more concerned with the fate of art than of people. And my mother used to work in the rag trade, the fashion industry in Manchester, and we had Jewish friends who had lost family to the Holocaust. And for me to dwell on burning libraries in such a context felt like a set of war priorities, almost barbaric. But later, as an adult and an architecture journalist and a heritage protection officer in London, the war in Bosnia started, and with it we saw the shelling of libraries, the dynamiting of mosques, and arson attacks on Ottoman-era market buildings and homes. And there was a new phrase to take in, ethnic cleansing, the murder and expulsion of entire communities, and the calculated eradication of any memory that these people had lived in a place. When, during the Bosnian War, the Serbian nationalist mayor Zvornik in Bosnia was asked what happened to the mosques and Muslims in this town, he claimed that there never were any mosques in Zvornik. All evidence of centuries of existence in the town had been removed, people and places, or at least this had been attempted. Suddenly, and I might have been slow on the uptake here, the issue crystallised for me. This was Kristallnacht again, when a night of synagogue destruction saw the Nazi attempts to rid their cities of the visible architectural evidence of Jewish life. Kristallnacht presaged the Holocaust. It was part of the same process. It seems so obvious now, the connection between the fate of the people and the fate of their culture. The destruction of architecture, of a group's material culture, can be genocidal in its intent. These days, sadly, people easily understand the theme of the book and the film that you're about to see immediately. They don't need it explaining. It's ever present as an issue. Attacks on churches from Indonesia to Nigeria and from mosques from India to Europe. The calculated destruction of people's heritage is a surefire way to attack their identity, to undermine their right to belong in a place, now, in the future, and just as importantly, in the past. It's an attempt to render people other, lesser, and there's no need to feel guilt about the fate of material culture in such circumstances. Attacks on the library and the librarian are different elements of the same phenomenon. And so to the film. This is the first ever showing of the film anywhere. It's been made by a documentary maker called Tim Slade, and who's based in New York, and is launched properly in New York at the Lincoln Center in January. I can't claim much credit for it myself. I only gave advice here and there, not wanting to be one of those terrible writers who breathes on the neck of another creative. And I parroted it briefly. But it does quote from my book directly. There are also some significant differences. There are just too many conflicts for any one film to cover. So it focuses on some and also brings the story up to date. But that said, I think it's otherwise gratifyingly faithful to the book, and I appreciate that very much. What you'll see now is what's known in the trade apparently as a fine cut rather than the final version. It's the cinema version of the documentary, and there's going to be a shorter edit for TV as well. And this fine cut doesn't have the final narrator, and there are low resolution images and footage here and there to allow for, so please allow for that. And unfortunately, given world events, it keeps having to be re-edited as Daesh attack Middle East's heritage and the West drops more useless bombs on cities in Syria. There also needs to be a copyright protected watermark across the film for now, so I hope that doesn't take too much away from the appreciation. And I will say a few words afterwards and then welcome any questions. Thank you. As you can see, that's very much a work in progress. There's still lots of editing going on, and particularly towards the end where it goes out of sync, and the running numbers, etc. But I think it's a great summation of many of the issues that I covered in my book. But there are, of course, many other examples that could be drawn from relating to the targeted destruction of heritage or architecture more widely, such as the Sinification of Tibet, for example, or how Israel uses the construction and destruction of housing to create facts on the ground. The latter perhaps more falls into the category of ethnic cleansing rather than cultural genocide. But burning books is not the same as burning bodies, wrote Raphael Mencken. But he reminds us that when one intervenes against the mass destruction of churches or books, one arrives just in time to prevent the burning of bodies. About the time the first edition of the book was published in 2006, Abu Musab al-Zakari was killed in a US airstrike in Iraq. In the years leading up to his death, al-Zakari was known as the Emir of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and he'd made a habit of escalating into communal violence between Shia and Sunni, using the calculated bombing of Iraqi mosques, such as that of the Al-Aqsa Shrine in Samarra, one of the holiest in Shia Islam, to successfully provoke sectarian outrage. And since his death, al-Zakari's organisation has morphed into Islamic State, ISIS or Daesh. Daesh has inherited the Taliban and al-Zakari's brutal ways with heritage, demonstrating a keen understanding of the uses and abuses of architecture. The destruction of cultural sites can serve many purposes: terror, propaganda, conquest or genocide. In the past decade, the cultural catastrophe that results when built heritage is targeted for destruction in conflicts has intensified. Across the Islamic world in particular, the tactics favoured by al-Zakari have spiralled out of control in Syria and Iraq and across the countries that went through the Arab Spring. But while this destruction is informed superficially by the iconoclastic religious doctrine that has its origins in Puritan Wahhabism, it is essentially political in nature, an ideology that challenges the post-colonial settlement, the illogical externally imposed national boundaries, and the corrupt repressive regimes backed by the West and Russia that have followed. Such regimes have formed a Western capitalist model on their people, only without its freedoms and with added brutality, corruption and hopeless poverty. Iconoclastic activities have a history going back millennia, but in its latest Islamicist interpretation, it's about forging a new identity that rejects the hegemony of the West. And this attitude is encapsulated in the name of Nigeria's Boko Haram, often translated as Western education is forbidden or Westernization is sacrilege. In their failure, the revolutions of the Arab Spring have created the vacuum that such ideas rush to fill. From the Maghreb to Pakistan and beyond, identities are being asserted that are uncompromisingly hostile to churches, Shia shrines, Sufi tombs, cemeteries, secular archaeology, museums or World Heritage Sites. Indeed, it could be argued that some of this destruction is being directed to the West as a consumer or of the images. Some of the destruction that happened in Mali one bout of destruction appeared to happen to coincide with resolutions of the World Heritage Committee of UNESCO in St. Petersburg that year. But there's the response in the West has been to assert the universal value of cultures, a shared past. But to some anti-Western Islamists, the very idea of a universal heritage, as espoused by Western museums and UNESCO, is an externally imposed notion. In 2001, the Taliban's Mullah Omar teased the West that it idolised the Bamyan Buddhas and cared more about them than it did about the Afghani people suffering in poverty. Why should extreme Islamists, or anyone for that matter, be expected to trust in such universalism when the West's Enlightenment project has only brought subjugation to their regions? And when we remove and destroy statues in our own cultures that represent values that we're not happy with, isn't this a hypocrisy, a similar inability to live with the real past, a denial of history, enforced forgetting? So what to do? From Bosnia onwards, bouts of cultural destruction have led to enormous amounts of hand-wringing, to bureaucratic UN resolutions, inflammatory suggestions of armed intervention to protect historic sites, and deluded proposals to fly out valuable artefacts for safekeeping in the great museum storehouses of New York, London and Paris, while leaving persecuted populations behind to suffer the horrors of war or drown in the Mediterranean. Here, however, Daesh, for all its strictly horrifying videos of stonings, immolations and hammer drills taken to Assyrian Lamassu, is unwittingly serving the long-term interests of the would-be protectors of heritage and the guardians of human rights, because the links between the two are now being made more clearly than ever. In theory, at least, the prosecution of cultural destruction should, to some degree, have been a deterrent to this destruction. Unfortunately, international law, as we've seen in the film, is not fit for purpose, not only because it's inadequate to deal with non-state protagonists, but because it continues to separate out cultural crimes from crimes against humanity. Cultural genocide, the erasure of a people by erasing their group identity so that they cease to exist as a group rather than through mass murder, is still not accepted as genocidal under international law. And as discussed in my book and in the film, it need not have been this way. Lemkin was convinced that genocide was made up of both barbarity and vandalism. And he wrote, "Vandalism is means the destruction of the cultural pattern of a group, such as the language, the traditions, the monuments, archives, libraries, churches, the shrines of the soul of a nation." And as we saw, as adopted by the United Nations, the Genocide Convention omits altogether the concept of cultural vandalism as genocide. Only attacks on the human body, the mass murder principally, were accepted as genocide. There were the various Cold War political reasons for that. But if we really want to do something about Islamic State's destruction of monuments, we need to honour Lemkin's efforts and make cultural genocide a crime. But we should reject any idea of intervening in a conflict simply to save monuments while leaving the descendants of their creators to suffer. Because in some ways Mullah Omar was correct in his criticism. Until the West can demonstrate that it understands that the fate of people and their culture are interlinked, there will be no resolution to the continuing attacks on both. Thank you.
I want to thank you, Robert, and I would have a million things to say, but I will not say any, because we have like 10 minutes, 5 minutes, we have 30 seconds, 4 minutes, 37 seconds to take your questions, if you have questions for Robert, of course. It's hard to react, no? No, because I mean, these questions so many things. It questions the concept of archaeology itself today, the concept of heritage, what happens in these conflictual lands reflects in how we consider heritage in our areas. So there's so many branches that could be developed that you need a series of lectures so that we can develop specific questions. But I think on one side we can only say, oh my God. On the other side, we can only say that UNESCO should have more power in dealing and negotiating with countries to enforce the laws and the resolutions. On the other hand, we can also say, I mean, something will go lost. Now we have to deal with that too. And also, it is interesting how a city like Rome is it's a very specific, also a terrible stage for this discussion, because the city of Rome has been growing on top of its own destruction every age, every year, every moment. So if we come to the archaeology of the architectural or urban side of this discussion, would be another million issues we could discuss, starting from this. It's very important, and the film is very interesting because it takes the discoveries of your book on, no? It takes it to our days, so it's fully developed. We can only, on my side, we can only congratulate for the work, and this should be shown, you know, widely in schools and possibly all over the world, probably, you know? But I'm sure somebody is meditating about saying something, or I know also that the Academy is very eager to say thank everybody and see you in the next beautiful events that Marina has been scheduling for this program. Thank you, Robert, and I mean, you'll be welcome here in Rome forever now. Grazie.